Okay, well, welcome to Binkhorsts and Blockbusters, a podcast where we talk about stuff. I'm Kate,
I'm Garrett.
and tonight we are going to be talking about some movies and television, blockbusters, including Reservoir Dogs, a movie that I know I watched when I was too young to watch it. And it's a movie that, you know, has is really big in a lot of people's minds, including my own.
It's ironic we start a podcast about blockbusters, and the first movie is arguably the most famous indie film that's ever been made. But I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, but first, what's on the TV?
So recently, I've been watching this show, The Clearing, on Hulu, and I wish I wasn't watching it. It is coming out week to week, and it's the kind of show that you would binge on a Saturday, and instead, I get to watch it every Wednesday and find out a little bit more about what's going on. It's the story about a cult, loosely based on true events in Australia. I like it. I wish I had waited until it came out in its entirety.
This is the problem with episodic television and the streaming platforms that provide this bingeability. Um, it's something that I think as we've grown up, we understood the episodic nature of television, and then suddenly with all these streaming services coming out and dumping full seasons on us all at once, we've gotten a bit spoiled for when it returns to the weekly model.
Yeah, and I think that for some shows, I like the weekly model, especially like the prestige television. Like The Great is a show that, despite it not being out on the weekly model, it all came out at once. I've very much been watching like one episode at a time and letting it digest. So I think that the episodic model works for some TV, but some TV it just doesn't. It's that the TV does not have enough meat to it to warrant watching it from week to week. It's just something that you want to just watch and it be over.
I would agree with that. There's a lot of things on that we like to talk about week to week, but there are sometimes just times you want to watch an entire dumb animated show or a small docu-series all at once and get through it, either because it's really engaging or because you can't click off of it. Like you're happy to have something that you can sit on and watch.
Yeah, and I think for true crime and for docu-series like that, just being able to binge it really works. And even though they'll try to do cliffhangers and stuff like that, like the show's not built on that. It's built on unraveling the mystery. And it's hard to do that when you have to wait a week and forget, about details and blah, blah, blah. So it just doesn't work as well.
It's definitely a hard balance to strike.
Yeah.
Would you recommend other people tuning into The Clearing?
I would recommend that if you like true crime and cults and docuseries to tune into it in about 3 or 4 weeks when it's all on Hulu.
Okay, sounds like a solid plan. I like true
Also,
crime, so I might check this one out.
so that the blonde lady is played by Eowyn from Lord of the Rings, and it took me like 3 weeks to figure that out. So there's
Ah,
that too.
I see. So, dear listeners, you're going to understand quickly that we either exclusively reference actors by other characters that they've played, or by their names because we don't remember the names of the characters they play. It's never going to be consistent, but you're going to learn a lot about the type of content we've enjoyed by the obscure references that we give for these characters.
Absolutely.
So moving on to what was on my TV this week. and I think everybody in our family decided to watch the new episode of the Grand Tour Euro Crash. Uh, so Top Gear was basically always on the television, at least as long as I can remember. But the best part of Top Gear and the best part of the Grand Tour are always the adventure episodes where they go somewhere in the world, taking cars that really shouldn't be going anywhere and doing a lot with them. And this is very similar.
Yeah, I have to say the adventure shows were always the best. The shows where they only did one thing, such as trying to find the Nile in Africa or riding motorcycles through Vietnam. But I have not seen this yet, so where do they go? Eurotrash, so Europe.
So yeah, so they start in Poland and they go south through the Eastern Bloc countries to I think they end in Slovakia.
Ah, yeah, we are a family who loves autos and auto racing and knows absolutely nothing about cars, despite watching Top Gear for many, many hours.
Yeah, no, I know nothing about cars, but this they go to the and this is probably the most interesting part is they go to the camp that the Great Escape story took place in.
Oh, wow.
Um, and that was interesting because you got to see that. And The Great
Yeah.
Escape is a fantastic movie with,
Yeah.
another automotive legend, Steve McQueen.
And a true story, too.
Yes, and a true story.
You know, based on true events in World War II.
Yeah, based on true, very, very terrible events, but a really excellent movie.
Hmm.
So if you like Top Gear, if you like the Grand Tour, you'll probably like this. It's more of the same. They don't really do anything to push new bounds. Uh, Jeremy Clarkson continues to be offensive, but not too offensive to get totally canceled off of everything. But the start of the episode does talk a lot about how they want to go on adventures elsewhere in the world, but due to various geopolitical conflicts and the fact that Jeremy Clarkson is banned from entering several countries, including India, they're not going many places anytime soon.
Sounds like a good one. I'll have to watch that this weekend.
And now we move on to our main event, talking about Reservoir Dogs. So to give, I think, a short overview of Reservoir Dogs, if you haven't seen it, it's a very classic and iconic film by Quentin Tarantino. It's his debut film, and it cements a lot of the hallmarks of his films, including violence, a lot of pop culture, a lot of music, and really well written and executed dialogue. Reservoir Dogs centers around the aftermath of a heist gone wrong and features a colorful cast of characters in their hunt to find who ratted them out. Uh, so I really like this movie. I too watched this when I was probably too young. I think it was one of the first things I ever watched on Netflix, which is funny because that's where I had to go to watch it this time.
Wow. Oh my gosh. I can remember. So I'm sure I watched scenes from Reservoir Dogs before I watched the whole thing, which is another theme that will come up in this podcast is us being subjected to television while channel flipping. So there are some scenes of movies we've seen hundreds of times, and other scenes just once, maybe, or have no recollection of. I remember renting this movie from the local movie rental store that wasn't a Blockbuster.
You're right next to the pharmacy.
Yeah. Yeah, so like, going back in time to the early 2000s when you rented movies. I think it was on DVD, so there's that.
There were tons of VHS there. I think that was the dominant one there.
Well, and I did have a VHS player in my room before I had a DVD player. And I think it was on DVD. So, but I mean, probably too young to have really watched this movie. It did come out in my lifetime, so there's that.
Yes, it came out in 1992.
Yeah.
So there are a couple things we want to talk about with this movie, and I think there are a few topics that we'll touch, going through it. But I guess we can start with the beginning of the movie.
Hmm.
So the movie opens with all of our heisters, all of the gangsters sitting around at a diner, and it starts with some interesting dialogue from Quentin Tarantino's self-insert character, which is actually kind of a theme of his movies. Um, and he's talking about the song "Like a Virgin" and trying to explain what it means. And I think this is a good opening to really exemplify, like, you need to think about what the movie is saying beyond just what it's showing you. And I think that's something that, obviously we can read into things a lot, and we read into a lot of media. And that's, half the reason we're talking about this, because we have something to say about our interpretations of what's going on. And
Hmm.
I think that's just a good start to the film to get you thinking about what's, happening a layer deeper. What do some of these signs mean? What are the characters actually doing? And what does that mean?
Well, and it's provocative too. I mean, it's a song about sex, and Quentin Tarantino's character makes it very much about sex in a very provocative way in his interpretation. And it's also that like boys club of sitting around at a diner talking about, you know, boys things. It's certainly not a women's movie. And thinking about it, other than, I mean, we never really see the waitress, so I don't think that there's a single woman in this film. Oh, there is. There is one.
Oh, yes, yes, there is.
So I
Um,
guess we should talk about spoilers.
yeah,
Go watch this movie. Like if you haven't seen this movie, go watch this movie and come back later.
yeah, it's very hard to talk about it without talking about spoilers, because it's very much a mystery movie.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And the way that Tarantino lays out all of his movies is in a non-linear way. So, this scene, the scene that opens the movie is the morning of the heist. This is a heist movie, so it's the morning of. But the next scene after this is farther back in the future or in the past. It's not farther back in the future. So, actually it might be when they're in the car. But anyway, the jumping back and forth creates deeper levels to the mystery of what's going on, who did what, and it slowly unravels over the course of the movie where you find out what's really going on here.
well put.
But I do think the only woman in the movie is the one who is in the car that they hijack and who you find out shoots Mr. Orange.
Yes. And then Mr. Orange, as a reaction, shoots and presumably kills her.
Right. Which is up until that point, you think that Mr. Mr. Orange was shot by a cop. So, and you also know that he also is a cop at that point. So there's that great like turn of like, oh my gosh, wait a second. He wasn't shot by his own kind. He was shot by this woman who he then killed, and he's a cop who killed her. And this is 1992. The perception of cops in America is different, and in LA and in different communities than it is right now for sure. The mobster mentality against cops was different than we have right now. And thinking about that in this turn of, oh, he wasn't really shot by a cop, and the cops aren't coming to save him kind of a situation is very interesting. And the moral dilemma too of shooting a civilian, the only woman in the film.
Well, I also think that that is the moment that the viewer understands Mr. White's perspective of why he, trusts and doesn't think Mr. Orange is the rat, because a cop wouldn't have shot somebody like that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and he did it very much from the hip of like surprise and yeah. So back to the first scene.
like the movie, we'll jump around a lot.
I mean, you have to. I especially having watched it a few days ago, like the way we process movies as we're watching them and as time is not linear in the movie. At the end, when it all comes together in your mind, you start to repattern it into the order that you perceive things to have actually taken place. So it's hard to actually remember when all of these things happened in the movie versus when they were supposed to have happened in the actual timeline.
Right, exactly. And we see a little bit of that in one of the first warehouse scenes, which is our second and really only other location in the film, where as the crew gets back together, they're trying to put together like what really happened and all the chaos.
Hmm.
So what more did you want to say about the opening diner scene?
Well, the dialogue is amazing. The and this is our first introduction to these characters. Quentin Tarantino, who is always in his own films, his whole monologue about Madonna. Then you have the older mob boss Joe going on in his notebook about Toby and trying to figure it out. And Harvey Keitel's character just flips out on him and says, "No, I'm not listening to this bullshit anymore, because this is not what we're here for." So it presents the mob boss character as not really having it all together. So that's kind of our first clue that maybe things are not going to go the way we think they're going to go.
Right. And towards the end of the scene, after Steve Buscemi's character, Mr. Pink, goes on a little bit of a rant about tipping, which we'll get to at the end. Um, Mr. Orange uh, is very quick to respond to Joe, the leader gangster, the old man, about the conversation and about tipping. And this kind of clues you in as he's very detail oriented. He's very, keen to what's going on in the conversation, even though it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And
Yeah, he is very smooth and poignant about pointing out that Mr. Pink, this kind of like he's not flamboyant in a gay way, but in a, personality way. And he's quick to point to be the quiet guy at the table who points out the guy who's doing wrong, which, is very cop-like behavior.
And it goes into a few other scenes later on when we know that Mr. Orange is, listening in on these conversations to understand, oh, Joe and Mr. White have a history because of how they buddy around with each other. Taking the book as one example of that. And
Right.
all of that is just trying to find details to figure out who these people actually are so they can arrest them.
Yeah.
So, uh, I think one of the very interesting things about this movie is when we get into the heist, we never actually see it. The only thing we see of the heist is them casing it out, going over the plan, and Mr. Pink running away.
Yeah.
We're left to conclude what happened there as a result of mostly Mr. Blonde and Mr. White kind of recounting what happens. Um, and one of the things I think is interesting here is that I think if the police in the film never intervened in the robbery, it would have gone a lot better for the police.
Yes. Definitely.
because it's mentioned that these jewelers are insured for what's being stolen from them. That if they press the silent alarm, it's going to take 4 minutes or so for the police to show up, and in that time they'll have taken the gems. They'll be in their cars and they'll be gone. No civilians, no police are hurt. And in the film, it's very much the opposite. Many civilians are caught in the crossfire, and many police are also injured, shot and
Yes.
maimed.
Yeah, certainly shows the ineptitude on both sides of the planning and the, trying to stop them in a way that obviously didn't work out. Now, returning to the topic of the jewelry store and that we never see it, I do remember when I watched this the first time being a little confused and a little like I had trouble with this because I had never actually been in a jewelry store and had very little understanding of what that would be like. I think my mind filled in the blanks with some things from like a bank or like a bank heist. But now watching it this week, like I've been in that kind of a jewelry store. I can imagine, the pawn shop kind of an atmosphere. So I'm interested to hear what did you imagine and like how did that shape what you thought was going on?
That's something I hadn't really considered because I've never been in a jewelry store. The only like jewelry stores, like the first one that comes to mind is from a video game from Grand Theft Auto, where you go on a heist and you rob a jewelry store, and it's this big room that's laid out with all of these different cases and all sorts of gems and watches and bracelets, and a couple people that would like show it off to you. But I didn't really get that vibe from I think the one exterior shot we have, and it's just a big brick building with a single door. Um, so I really don't know what it would be like inside. I have no
Yeah.
idea. It
Yeah, leaving that up to interpretation is interesting. And it's also interesting because jewelry stores in general have changed so much from 1992 to now. I mean, in LA, a brick building, who knows what it would be like inside, but it's certainly not a Zales or like a mall jewelry store that we can imagine now.
right, right. Yeah, because those are very open, and
Yeah, open with lots of lights and shining
but
and
this wasn't just a jewelry store. This was somewhere that was getting jewels and gems that were being sold to other places. So like this was a bit more of like I think a distributor, and that's why the payout would be so big because it wasn't the little things, it was the big stuff.
right,
Um,
because they had something to move. Yeah. So that's the jewelry store. Um, which isn't even a location. Like it's not a location in the movie because we never really go there. The warehouse is the primary location in the movie, and it really only has two rooms in it. It has the big dock room and then a bathroom, which allows for a little bit of private conversation away from the quickly dying Mr. Orange.
I didn't realize until I watched it this time that it's a morgue. I
Oh, wow.
I think like I noticed, I probably noticed it before, but I didn't consciously register that like, oh, this is a morgue and everybody ends up dead.
I never realized it was a morgue. I just thought it was a warehouse.
So I in my research, it was filmed in a morgue in like a funeral home. Mr. Blonde sits on top of a hearse that's covered in a tarp,
Ah,
and the there are big like basically packages that are like stacked up, and one of them's open and it's a coffin that's turned like upwards, which is a weird way to display a coffin. Like it's not horizontal, it's vertical on one of the short sides. um and I think that that is really excellent foreshadowing, And I wonder if, I went back and watched it, maybe counted how many coffins there were that would sync up to how many bodies, but like that, that's a little bit far-fetched, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, yeah, that is such an interesting detail. I never knew. And then for them all to die in the dock area where they would bring in the bodies is even better.
Yeah, so do you think so in the final altercation there's a big shootout between everybody, and Steve Buscemi's character very rightly hides under the stairs while all these maniacs are waving their guns around at each other. And he the last shot we see of him, he runs out of there, grabs the jewels, leaves the people who are dying to die, and leaves. Do you think he escaped, or do you think the cops eventually got him?
See, I always thought that he escaped. But I did read on in doing some of the quick research that I did that was not very detailed that he gets caught outside. But I think that there's a long enough pause between him leaving and the sirens that you're supposed to assume that he gets away. But remember that Mr. Orange says to the cop that the cops aren't coming until Joe gets there. So, but they should have come in, they should have stormed in quicker. I don't know. Again, this is the ineptitude of the cops on display.
Yeah, I think there were many scenes before where there were just guns going off that I think the cops could have responded to at any moment. Um, and then that would have saved at least one of their own, if not both. But yeah, I agree. I want to say, due to the inaptitude of the cops, that Steve Buscemi's character gets away. But I have heard oh, well, you can hear them outside arresting him and that sort of thing. But again, I think it's one of those things. If you don't show it, it's up to our interpretation. And I like it better that Steve Buscemi got away.
Yeah, I do too. I like the idea that he escapes. Now it would be interesting to check, and I mean, I if this was an Easter egg somewhere, it would probably be there, or it would probably be more well known. That it would be interesting if Steve Buscemi's character shows up at some point in a later Tarantino movie, because he does that with several of the characters. I know Mr. Blonde is Vega's brother from Pulp Fiction. So
Right.
like
But
there's those connections.
uh, Mr. White is also in Pulp Fiction and plays a completely different character.
He does. And his in the conversation between Joe and Mr. White, he mentions Alabama, who is in the 1995 movie True Romance. So, there's connections to the greater web of Tarantino movies where characters play the same kind of character again, but not the same one. So that's an interesting thing too. And then, like, could Pulp Fiction have taken place before Reservoir Dogs? I'm not sure. I haven't read enough into the Tarantino verse lore.
There has been talk of him wanting to make a Vega Brothers movie with John Travolta and the other guy, but I think as the years go on, that's further and further from reality. I think that could have worked many years ago, but it would have to be a prequel to both of those films. And also, I think Tarantino I think he's working on his last film now, at least the last one he wants to make. But there have been many directors that have said that and decided not to. But
Yeah.
I don't think the speculation is really worth more than acknowledging these things have been said.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It might be something that gets done posthumously for everybody, as like a weird side project. But I don't think it's in Tarantino's or either of the actors' possibilities.
So going on to a bit of a different topic, and this is something that I noticed. definitely in the first time I watched this movie, everybody is wearing a suit. All the gangsters are wearing suits except for nice guy Eddie. And
Yes.
I always thought that was weird because even Joe's wearing like a black polo, but nice guy Eddie, who's Joe's son, he's wearing like a blue like windbreaker type thing. I
Yeah. It's very, very flamboyant, and I think it's one of the things that shows that Nice Guy Eddie maybe doesn't have it all together. That I mean, they joke in the scene with Mr. Blonde and Joe that Nice Guy Eddie's, running the family business into the ground, which is a joke. But at the same time, like, Nice Guy Eddie is not playing the role of gangster son in the same way that, like Al Pacino was in The Godfather. He's not taking that torch and running with it with the same panache.
right.
The suits are just such an interesting uniform, and because they're black suits. Like businessmen, especially in 1991, were not wearing, funeral clothes with tiny black ties when they were making their business deals. They were wearing, different colored suits and like blue suits. Like people don't wear black suits, out of nowhere. So the black suit uniform for these gangsters walking into this diamond store is such an interesting choice. And it really sets the stage for all future gangsters, doing stuff to be wearing that suit. It also, to me, is a great backdrop for all of the blood.
Yes. So one of the hallmarks of I think just about every Quentin Tarantino movie is violence and a lot of fake blood.
Mm.
Now I'm going to make a bold claim and say it is the words of this podcast that violent films, TV, and video games don't contribute at all to violent events in the real world. Uh, and Quentin Tarantino will very quickly shut your butt down if you try to say otherwise. Um, that was him verbatim in one of the interviews where somebody tries to call him out on it, and I just think that's ridiculous. But it very well highlights everybody who gets hurt when they're just white shirts are stained red.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have, not only does Mr. Orange have this very dark red stain which blossoms into this orangey gross, stomach wound, but Mr. White's character also has blood on him. And then in the scene with Mr. Blonde and the cop, the blood that gets on him is very specific in its placement, and it's not, all over the place like the mess that Mr. Orange has become. I mean, he literally becomes orange. I think that's an interesting thing to happen to him.
Yeah, and
Mr.
I
Pink, stays without any blood on him.
yeah, you could have changed some of their names and been like, oh, well, Mr. Pink's Mr. Yellow because he's a coward. But when they're going over their nicknames, Mr. Pink sounds a lot like Mr. Pussy. Like he kind of is. He stays out of that ending conflict and sinks away. I think that's really a good characterization. And sure, you could change Mr. Orange to Mr. Red, but again, I think that it goes a bit too much like hammer over the head with it. Um,
Yeah,
and Mr. White, attempts to be very, very pure in his analysis and judgment of people, and really tries to hold on to like himself and his own ideals throughout the movie, and that really comes to bite him in the ass at the end. Um,
yeah. Well, and Tarantino himself becoming Mr. Brown, the poop colored one. Like that's a funny joke on himself.
he's certainly okay with making fun of himself in his movies, which is great to see.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, especially if you're gonna act in your own movies, you might as well be the the lower run character.
yes, and other than Mr. Blue, everyone else is very well characterized. Mr. Blue exists, I think, almost exclusively in the diner scene and the um kind of like, I'm getting the crew together scene.
Hmm.
And I think him not having much of a character and just being there keeps the mystery going in the back of your mind, because they're asking, well, did he get out? Did he get shot? What happened to him? And the idea that, well, we don't know anything about this character. He's, the red herring. He's the rat until well, we get to the torture scene and everything really starts to uh, the pieces start to fall into place, so to speak.
Yeah, so do you want to talk about being stuck in the middle with you?
Yes. So I was in the record store that was in our town. It existed, then it disappeared, then it came back in the 2010s for some reason. And I was in there with one of my friends, and that song came on, and he was like, "I know I've heard this song before." And I said to him, "Yeah, it reminds me of cutting someone's ear off." And he was like, "Oh," and instantly, made that connection. And I think this is something that a lot of Quentin Tarantino movies do really well, which is connecting, music and certain song beats to scenes, and then having those almost always be indicative of, those memories that you choose. The torture scene, especially because it's very visceral in what it is, but it doesn't show as much as you might think it would. It's not as violent as I think a scene like that would be now.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest difference between, like, if you were to film this movie now, what would it have in it? It would have real torture, and you would really see that ear coming off, and you would really see, him getting slashed in the face. And in a way, this scene is actually very tasteful. You don't see any of that. They do it in such a way that it's completely hidden, and you don't see anything except the after effects, like how he looks once he has his ear cut off, which I'm not sure is what you would look like if you had your ear cut off, but whatever. I'm not a makeup person.
I mean, it's convincing. It's
Yeah,
like that's a guy who's missing part of his face,
yeah, yeah.
even though it's covered over in a prosthetic, it's still gruesome. Um,
Yeah. Well,
and
and I mean, I remember watching it the first time being, afraid of what I was going to see next. And, when I was watching it, it was in the era of the Saw movies and of the ones that were in Europe that were terrible.
the Hostel movies, yeah,
Hostel, yeah. Oh
the
God.
torture porn.
Yeah, yeah, torture porn era of cinema in the early 2000s. Like, I really thought I was going to see something terrible, and when he gets out the gasoline, I am just terrified as to what's going to happen next.
So when I watched it this time, I hadn't seen it in so long. I was like, wait a minute, does he really set him on fire? I don't remember that. And I was for a minute on the edge of my seat, like, how does this play out? I've forgotten. Because the first half of that scene is so iconic, it just overwrites whatever happens next.
Now, because I think I am more afraid of fire than I am of getting my ear cut off, I remembered the fire part.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. Well, and I also remember thinking like how much it would sting to have gasoline in a wound.
Yes. I think the cop would have been screaming a lot more.
Yes. And if the cops outside were anywhere near, they should have heard that.
Absolutely. They should have heard that. And then after seeing, a couple of the people leave the warehouse, as I'm sure they had eyes on it because they were looking for Joe, they probably, or they at least should have seen the cop being dragged in there. And I think that should have been when they stepped in, is when they knew
Yeah.
they had them outnumbered, because there's their cop on the ground and then another presumably being tortured. Um, so I think we'd be wrong to not bring this up when talking about such a violent scene. Torture is absolutely useless. You do this to long enough, they'll admit to whatever. Eddie explains this to Mr. Blonde, and he says, torture is going to lead him to admit that he started the Chicago fire, which is obviously wrong. It's obviously a lie. Um, and we get to the point where Mr. Blonde admits, like, well, I'm not going to get anything from you. I just want to do this for me. And a little bit of backstory on Mr. Blonde. He had just gotten out of prison for serving 4 years, where he didn't rat out, Joe and the other mobsters, gangsters, whatever. And I think this is a really excellent commentary on our prison system that really leads to a lot of resentment, not a lot of redemption or reformation, rehabilitation for these people that go in. And, a lot more of that gets communicated when they're talking about his PO officer and getting him a no-show job just so he can, get back to doing what he wants to do, which is illegal activities.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, they don't explain the details enough, but I mean, it is within the realm of possibility that he was being paid by the cops and nice guy, and he just doesn't want to believe that. Um, you know,
That is possible. But as we, kind of know throughout the scenes, that, isn't necessary. But
right. Yeah.
uh,
Well, there could be multiple inside men, but whatever. That's just me being a negative Nancy.
yeah, I'm sure other films and stories have done it. So after the torture scene, Mr. Orange regains some sense of sentience enough to stop his fellow police officer from being lit on fire, and absolutely unloads into Mr. Blonde and just kills him outright. And that kind of starts the doubt when the other gangsters get back of like, well, why the hell did you do this? Um,
Right. Yeah, and I was just thinking, and I thought this while I was watching it, that it was annoying to me that the other guys didn't believe him that that this guy about to set somebody on fire wasn't a bad enough thing. Like if I saw somebody in my life anywhere trying to set somebody on fire and I had the capacity to shoot that person, I would do that.
Right. And I think if he would have had a better line instead of, oh, he was going to run away with the gems, and been like, he was going to start a fire that was going to burn out of control, and like, that would, have the fire department on our ass, or like expose us more. Like, I think that would have been a better lie. But again, we're talking about somebody who's dying. So their uh, capacity for logical reasoning is not mine, who's sitting at a desk safe and sound. Um,
Yeah, yeah, the ability to come up with a good lie, especially when by that point in the movie we know that he is ultimately the snitch. Um, yeah, it's an interesting dialogue there, which I'm sure was done on purpose to make them start to question Mr. Orange.
Right. Especially at that point, they knew that Mr. Blue had been shot. I think Joe and Eddie learned that somehow, and the rest of them being dead. And then all that's left are Mr. Orange, somebody who's an outsider, Mr. Pink, and then two guys that Joe is, really good friends with and trusts. Um,
Hmm.
so uh, you know, in the non-linear nature, after this scene, we get a segment on Mr. Orange and who he is, and he's a cop in Los Angeles, and he's going undercover to try to figure this out. And he has a handler who he goes and meets at a diner, and they've got an in to Joe's crew. And this starts one of my favorite scenes in the movie, just because of how it's executed. And that's when they start talking about this commode story, where Mr. Orange needs to have an anecdote, a little story of a job or a heist he did that will he can tell the other gangsters that'll make him seem, cool and calm and capable. And I think this scene is done very well because in it, the handler introduces a script of like a very basic story that seems plausible, that's interesting, that is in some ways very relatable to these people, that they can go on to perform to gain their confidence. And in another movie, you could have Mr. Orange and his handler, playing out the scene with each other, and then we transition to Mr. Orange with the other gangsters doing it again. And you could see the differences. Mulholland Drive does something like that, and it's done to really great effect there. But here, we go through the whole story in a chronological order of the performance. So you start at the beginning of the story, and he's going over it with his handler, and then the next bit of the story, he's in his apartment performing it by himself, and then finally we get to the part where he performs it in front of others. And I think that was a really great way to uh, get us in his headspace of understanding where he was at and how much of a like performance and a farce this Mr. Orange character is.
Yeah, I think that that was a great way of doing it. I also really thought that the casting was interesting here too, because I mean, we're watching a movie that's 22 years old and, or no, 32 years old, crap. Um, where in 2023 we talk about race and casting, race and casting in different ways than we did in the 90s. So noting that cop who's telling him the story is the only non-white person in this film. So we talk about there's one woman and there's one non-white person in this whole film. And I thought that was an interesting casting decision to make there. And I mean, it's positive. I'm positive about this because
Right.
you have this black guy telling this guy how to be a gangster, and all of our knowledge of gangsters are Italians at this point. In 1992, the biggest gangster movies were The Godfather, The Godfather, The Godfather, and Goodfellas. So we don't really have the same kind of understanding of mobsters and gangsters like we do now with since we've had movies like Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels or Layer Cake or um, all the Vegas movies that transcend the Italian gangster you know genre. So I think that was such an interesting selection there.
Definitely.
But the message that he tells about how to construct a lie in telling this story over and over and changing the details to make it your own, but keeping the bones the same. I mean, what a masterful lesson.
Yeah, and one part that really stood out to me is he's like, you have to know this bathroom that you've walked into that's full of police. You have to know what kind of soap they have. You have to know if they have paper towels or the blow dryer. And then when we get to the scene where he's, washing his hands afterwards, as everybody should, he uses the blow dryer. And the cops in this scene uh, at several points appear to react to each other and then appear to react to Mr. Orange giving his performance. And in this scene, it's in this part, it's just the blow dryer. It's just that sound, and you can like feel him staring, and I think feel the police officer staring at him. And I think that that was definitely something that Mr. Orange himself created in there to, that was a part of the story that he was telling to those guys that he wasn't necessarily verbally saying to us, the audience.
Yeah, that he was staying cool, that he was under this, but also that he, it's another of many examples of just the ineptitude of the cops. Like the cops and that dog should have known he had drugs. The cops shouldn't have been just fucking around in the restroom. You know, like what were they doing standing in there other than just wasting everybody's time and taxpayer dollars? So the ineptitude of the cops is such a huge part of this movie that doesn't really, it's not as bright and shiny as like, oh, people messing up a heist.
Right, right. In many ways, the cops are just as incompetent, or portrayed to be just as incompetent as the heisters. Um,
Hmm.
and that takes me to one of the quotes I have from Joe, when he's giving, like, we're getting the gang together, and he says, you guys got to stop clowning around. None of these jokes. I've been in groups where everybody's joking around, and then all the heist goes to shit because nobody remembers what they're doing. And we have exactly one scene that goes over the heist that is punctuated by Mr. White just going, "Well, I'm hungry. Let's go get a taco." And it's not necessarily, like, that's not an inherently like a joke, but in every other scene where these guys are together, there's a sense of camaraderie that, like, okay, yeah, these guys are, like, bonding, but they're not bonding over the one thing that they're here to do together. Um,
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting too, because the failure in all of it was not because of the plan. Like despite not talking about the plan, they seem to have executed the plan pretty well. The failure was in having a rat amongst the participants.
exactly. Um, and we're reminded of, or Mr. White tells us of a job he was in where they found a rat early on, and you have to wonder, the fate of that guy, because they're never very clear on that. But you would sense that he would be the one that might be able to, like, uncover the mystery, and he's the one furthest from it. Um,
Right. He's been hoodwinked the best.
yes. So then, after this scene, we get to the end, and and there is a standoff between all the gangsters in a very, classic Clint Eastwood Western vibe of people pointing their guns at each other, accusing them of things, and it comes to blows, and everybody's able to get shots off.
Yeah, which is interesting because and confusing because it doesn't seem like there are. So Harvey is pointing, or Mr. White is pointing his gun at Joe, and Joe and Nice Guy Eddie are pointing their guns at Mr. White. Who kills Nice Guy Eddie?
I think, you know, I mean, it's got to be Mr. White, but I thought that Joe was pointing his gun at Mr. Orange. Mr. White was pointing his gun at Joe, and Eddie was pointing his gun at Mr. White.
Okay.
But again, it's one of those things where, we saw this movie a week ago, and we're having trouble, recounting
No,
this
I
detail. But it is important, and it is, somebody had to shoot twice.
right. Yeah, that's the point I'm making is that somebody had to shoot twice and it's not quite clear who did it and it's kind of a secret little moment that gets overlooked and I think that Tarantino did on purpose.
Yeah, because
Um,
in the chaos, we're left to question, well, wait a minute, maybe did I know Mr. Orange, shot off his whole gun at Mr. Blonde, but did he reload it at any point? I don't remember seeing that. Did he shoot one of them? Did he shoot Eddie? I don't remember. I don't know. And I think, uh, Tarantino, he does a really good job of, like, instilling in you the same chaos and dread that these people are feeling in his movies. Um,
Absolutely.
through these little, like, almost idiosyncrasies, these little things that are, like, outside of reality. Um, in some ways, I think in several Tarantino films there are, like, those, like, almost like surreal moments that make you go, like, what the hell was that? What was the point of that? And this is definitely one of those that teeters on that edge, like, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and then to punctuate that, Mr. Pink comes running out with the diamonds and leaves. So just proving that all of that was useless. And
Yes.
yeah.
Well, the worst part is that the cops who, storm in there, they see Mr. White shoot Mr. Orange and then they shoot him. Everybody's dead. Nobody can be brought in on anything because all these gangsters are dead. And rather than, solving this problem of, oh, there's this gangster Joe out on the street, now Joe's, lieutenants and people underneath him, well, they're going to start new criminal enterprises, or they're going to take over, and and the police are now back to square one on their detective work of trying to figure out how to take down this organization.
The good thing is though, they're already in the morgue.
Yes, they don't have to go anywhere. We don't have to, use ambulances or other, government resources to move them around.
Yeah, you can just take a hose to that concrete.
It washes right off.
Yeah. So I think, do you have anything else about your timeline you wanted to mention there?
I don't think so. I think we've touched on everything I really wanted to talk about. I think we brought some, interesting dialogue to some of these scenes and talked about things that I don't think, I've heard other people talk about this movie.
There's one scene that I wanted to touch on really quickly was
Okay.
the very cinematic way in which Mr. Orange gets ready to leave his apartment to go meet the gangsters for the first time, and he fishes his wedding ring out of the bowl. And I thought that that was such a beautifully done cinematic scene that was completely useless toward the plot or toward, like, his wife's never mentioned. There's no, like, girlfriend or widower situation ever mentioned. It doesn't come up in the commode story, but it was such a beautiful little vignette in the middle of that scene, which is another thing that Tarantino is great at. But
But
usually these vignettes connect to something.
so I you brought this up before we started recording this, and I've thought about it, and because it's never brought up that at this point he's playing the character of Mr. Orange, um, and not the police officer, you would think that this could be, a good clue for Mr. White that this guy's not everything he says he is. Because if you're dying, if you're bleeding out, he's trying to get Mr. White to like be his friend and like, tell him about himself. And Mr. White's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna do that because you're dying and I want to comfort you. But you would think someone who's dying in that situation would be like, you gotta tell my wife I'm sorry. Or
Yeah,
something like that,
yeah.
and
That
and
that is
you
a really interesting point.
you get none of that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it would be an interesting thing for Mr. White to say that, to be like, oh,
Just
your
think about
wife's
your
gonna
wife,
leave
buddy.
you soon or something. Yeah, that would be. But again, the having a wife thing goes against the commandments they were given early on to not tell each other anything about them, anything personal. Don't talk about anything personal. An interesting little detail.
Yeah, I would agree. It was something that, I've seen this film a number of times. I've seen that scene. I remember it, but, you know, I think
Yeah.
really when it comes down to it, that's sort of what it means is it's another one of those details for us and for the other characters to like have picked up on and to, be able
Hmm.
to understand.
Well, and he certainly wasn't living in an apartment with his wife either. Like that was a
No.
bachelor pad for
Uh,
sure.
so in my research, I learned that apartment is refitted rooms that are above the morgue that they filmed this in.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so we talked a bit about at the beginning about this being an indie film, and when it comes down to it, like it was kind of amazing that it got it made. Some people saw the script, liked it, and Tarantino was able to like get real actors in to do it. Previously, he was going to use his friends and like a budget of like I think $30,000 to make the film. But then once Harvey Keitel got in on it. They raised $1.5 million to make it, and were able to get in Steve Buscemi, Michael Madsen, and Tim Roth. And the rest is history. But it's interesting to see where that money and energy went, because there are many other smaller scenes. There's a club, there's a bar, there's the diner, there's Joe's office with the weird mammoth tusks behind him.
Wow, I didn't notice those.
Well, they're mammoth or elephant. There's some ivory tusks. I always thought it was weird, but
Yeah, I mean that is a weird thing.
maybe they were real. Maybe that's where the budget went.
So, well, and that's interesting too, because the guy who played Joe was a older actor that had appeared in 1950s um, mobster movies. So, well, gangster mobster, like he had been in older movies in a similar genre, not the same kind of deal for sure.
Mhm.
So I thought that was an interesting selection and made sense. I'm sure that there are, movie connoisseurs that know way more about him than I do. But I also think that the casting of having all these guys who are fantastic actors and not as well known before this. I mean, Steve Buscemi had done one Coen Brothers movie before this. Um, I'm not entirely sure about everybody else, but really fantastic casting. And I mean, these are actors that show up in a lot of great films after this.
Mhm. So yeah, so glowing recommendations all around for this film. I hope you got something out of our analysis, and I hope this has gotten you to think a little bit more about the movies that you watch and sort of how you can have these conversations with your friends.
Yeah,
Um,
or
if
don't. It's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, or just turn your brain off and watch Fury Road, really loud and enjoy it and have a great time. Um, I really like that movie, but I do turn my brain off when I watch it and just go, cars go kaboom.
Ha.
So, uh, unless you have anything to add, we're going to move on to our next segment.
Only that I don't refer to that movie as Fury Road, but as the new Mad Max. Like, what?
Well, it's hyphen. There's a hyphen there.
I'm gonna guess.
Okay. So our next section is a mystery. So this is our mom's pick of the week. So to kind of introduce this, we've been doing a family Zoom call throughout the pandemic and now into 2023. And both of our parents are now retired and they have all the streaming services. So this means that they watch a lot of stuff on television. And our mom never remembers exactly what she watched. So as a bit of a game and to induce engagement in the comment section of wherever this is posted, uh, you have the ability to guess what movie our mother watched this week and told us about.
Yeah, this is a segment that really is the reason why we put this podcast together. So do you wanna go ahead with so I guess I'll start with the title. She goes, it's I was watching this show called Mayfair something.
Right. So that's what you have to go on. This is usually where we start with the what did you watch, is trying to figure out what the name of it was. Um, so chief complaints from our mother on this film were that she wouldn't even give it a 1-star review, and it would have been interesting if it was executed correctly. And she talked about watching a dubbed film, because despite the fact of reading thousands and thousands of books, reading a movie isn't that great. And she said the dubbing was very poor and that it switched between being dubbed and then being subtitled. Um, she also said something about it starring some Samoans, which we later learned was probably false. Um, but it includes two Hindi detectives who are investigating a serial killer in London, and
Yes.
that's all you get, folks.
Yeah, unknown time period. We tried to determine that. She did not give any further details. Um, yeah, she said that it was horrid. She did not like it. So mom's pick of the week is a do not watch, but good luck on figuring out what it is.
Yeah, you'll get a pinned comment or a like or a 5 star or just a good old thumbs up from us if you figure out what it was.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. We look
so,
forward to your recommendations on detective stories.
yeah, because invariably somebody's going to come up with something that isn't this, but is about serial killers in London that our mom would probably enjoy a lot more.
Yes, this is a good thought. I will say I do understand what she was getting at when she said her complaint about it switching back and forth between languages and that being confusing because we had earlier in this year both mom and I had watched 1889, a show on Netflix about a ship that's full of people from different backgrounds. And in that movie, they very much switched back and forth between the characters who were immigrants on the ship talking in their native languages and then talking in English, and then somehow all being able to communicate to each other. And it was very confusing. And I did think that was a huge complaint. I thought it should have been all either all in English or all in um, subtitles because that would have made more sense. But there also is a supernatural element to that show, so maybe that had something to do with it. That whatever was going on with the ship allowed them to communicate in tongues. I don't know, but I understood her complaint a little bit.
I mean, we're watching a movie. I can suspend disbelief that everybody who's talking can share a language. And if not, then you should do something interesting with it. Um, Also, subtitles over dubbing, that's my stance.
Well, it depends on the quality of the program. If I want to sit and watch something, I'm okay with subtitles. If I am going to be doing other things, which mom always is doing other things, dubbing is better. But, you know, there's pros and cons to each.
Yes, this will be a debate that could go on for many many videos, and
I'm sure we'll talk about it again.
yeah. So the final segment of our podcast is entitled "The Rolodex of Food Memories." So food is very important to our family. It's pretty much the universally the only thing we all agree with is good. Um,
Yes. Yes,
and
and we believe most food is good. There is
yes,
very, very limited amount of food that is bad, but
yes,
there is bad food. We'll just
correct. So initially, I was under the assumption that this section would talk about food that we have seen in the movie, and there is no food in this movie. If you're familiar with the YouTuber Binging with Babish, she's made a career making food from movies and TV. I thought we could capitalize on that by just talking about it, but there was no food in this movie. Um,
no, but there was a diner.
yes, there was a diner, there was a bar, there was coffee. So we mentioned earlier about talking about this segment. On your screen right now is Mr. Pink, played by Steve Buscemi, playing the world's smallest violin for waiters and waitresses everywhere. At the start of the film, we're introduced to a little bit of a rant he goes on about a policy of not tipping, uh, just out of principle and because he doesn't think that he should have to supplement the wages of income of anybody if he's paying for the meal, which is something that I agree with, but policy does not. So I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor to get some numbers so we could better understand this scene. So in the state of California right now, there are about it's estimated there are about 220,000 employed waiters and waitresses. And the mean hourly wage of this group is $17.82. If you take that to the buying power of 1992 when this came out, that's a little over $8. Similarly, that's about the tip that the waitress was given, with everybody putting in a buck, was about $8. Um, so I learned a little bit about how minimum wage works in other states, and the state of California is required to pay $15.50 before they pay tips, or that's money that is guaranteed to tipped workers, and then they can get tips on top of that. But other regions have different minimums and different policies, other counties. It's the hard thing about researching this is, yeah, states have different things. The federal government has different statutes. Local regions have different things. But the federal minimum wage is where things get interesting. Since 1991, the federal minimum cash wage is $2.13, and currently there's a tip credit of $5.12. So in the federal government, if you, over the course of a month, make $30 in tips, you are able to become a tipped employee, and your employer can pay you the federal minimum wage and supplement that with cash to get you to our abysmal federal minimum wage of $7.25.
Yeah, when you brought out the $17 average in California, I was like, that's really good actually. Like that's a decent wage, but yeah, it's different all over the country, and $2 since, so that means so they've never raised it since
They,
1991.
they've never raised the minimum cash wage, no.
Wow. So my entire life, the
Yes.
lifespan of the average millennial, there's been no change to the cash wage for waiters and waitresses.
Correctamundo. Uh,
Wow.
Now, however, this is where things get slightly more grim. Uh, so, if you don't know, our United States government gets paid some money. And uh, the members of Congress who are, responsible for, uh, you know, doing our laws and things, in 1991, uh, a congressman and senators were paid $125,000 a year. That has the equivalent buying power now of nearly $250,000. Now, in 2023, the typical congressperson makes $174,000 a year. This is 12 times the annual federal minimum wage if a worker works 2,000 hours a year. And if you are working a service-based job, you are lucky if you have such stability. This is also 5 times that mean California tipped hourly wage of 1782. So no matter what way you cut it, our government is making many, many, many more times your salary, certainly mine. And well, they're not doing anything to raise yours in the past 30 years.
Yeah, that is a grim bit of statistics there. I uh, I didn't need to know those numbers. Thank you, Garrett.
Yeah, it's important that I, as a voice of I guess Zoomers, or maybe we're called Doomers now. I don't know. It's important to realize the massive wealth inequality in our country, um, and abroad, but also to remember that it's the government's fault that tipping exists because they refuse to do away with it. Because
Absolutely. Well, and this was something I kind of thought about during the movie, and something that I think we'd actually talked about a few weeks ago was that, now there's an expectation to tip waitress positions. So like the Dunkin' Donuts employees, if you order a sandwich at a place where they hand you the sandwich at the register, there's a tip jar there. So there is a different dichotomy now on the tipping culture, where as it used to be, you tipped somebody who was directly giving you a service, directly. Specifically, people
Yes.
at cash registers were not expected to be tipped, but now, every time you use one of those little iPad things, it comes up with a suggestion to tip the staff at the Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate quickly that it's not just waiters and waitresses who are tipped employees. It's also anything from hairdressers, valets, hotel attendants,
Yeah, delivery
plethora of
driver.
other jobs. Yeah, delivery drivers, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And I saw in California, uh, it was they did an average of about, if you're a fast food worker per meal, you're getting about a tip of 15%. Whereas if you're in a sit down restaurant, you're getting a tip closer to 20%. But again, none of that is a guarantee. You could get a fat zero.
Yeah. Yes, the moral of this story is if you have the money, tip your waiters and waitresses and your lawn care people and your delivery guys and whoever, tip them really well. If you don't have a lot of money, still tip them.
And if you're in any position of power, do something about this, please.
Yeah, this is definitely something that we need to get rid of, and I know that there are a lot of things that this is the only country in the world where this happens. This is actually tipping is not something that is expected throughout the world. I know a lot of places in Europe they don't do tips. They just pay people real wages. It's also a great way for employers to get around things like having benefits packages and those kinds of things. So
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but this is reality. And we used our first episode to touch on real social issues. And
real social issues.
again, this is the layer. This is the dick in Like a Virgin. This is the listen to what these people are saying, because they're saying something interesting for you to talk about and reflect on 30 years later and realize nothing has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing has changed. Madonna's still cool. Tipping is still something that you should do. Um, Cops still bad. Still
Yes.
bad.
Yes.
Yeah. So to end on a less sad statistic, I have not ate any interesting food lately. Tell me about the most interesting food that you have had.
Okay. So yesterday, I went on a walk, and when I got done, I was hungry. And I had watched a TikTok or a YouTube short or another very short dopamine inducing video clip of somebody making macaroni and cheese.
Oh,
And uh, macaroni and cheese is fantastic in all of its many shapes and forms, but this was amplified by the addition of breadcrumbs, fried chicken, and scallions in the video. And I decided I could do one better. And uh, I made a mac and cheese using two different types of cheddar, one white, one orange, and oh, just like the two main characters of the film we watched. Um, and I had made fried chicken and covered that in some buffalo sauce. Topped the mac and cheese with it. Added some blue cheese crumbles, some scallions, and jalapenos.
wow.
Yes.
That
Uh,
sounds incredible.
when you live in turbulent times such as ours, any meal could be your last, so make it a good one.
Indeed. Well, I think that's all for that's all we got. This has been Binkhorsts and Blockbusters.
Thank you for watching. Do all the things to bump the engagement, share it with your friends, talk about movies, have movie nights, watch these old things, support good creators, tip your waitresses, and good night.
Good night, all.